Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and perhaps good evening to many of you. My name is Doug Lamb. I'm with McGuireWoods in Richmond, Virginia, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Durham McCormick and Ryan Bernstein. We're going to be speaking today about carbon capture and storage tax credits under 45Q of the Federal Tax Code. For starters, we want to thank and we are very grateful for the Coalition for Renewable Natural Gas's commitment to education and excellence in the RNG world. We have been members, supporters, and collaborators with the RNG Coalition since its founding, and we very much appreciate your time and attention today and for this opportunity to speak with you about carbon capture and storage credits. Together, McGuireWoods Consulting and McGuireWoods collaboratively advocate for renewable energy projects, offering clients a unique dynamic that allows them to achieve their development goals in a coordinated and efficient manner. Our attorneys and public affairs professionals work together to educate communities, government officials, staff, regarding the true impacts of renewable energy projects. We handle every legal and community support aspect associated with these projects, from zoning, local approvals, local and state law compliance, negotiations, grassroots, grasstops, consensus building, digital media campaigns, public relations management, and everything in between. McGuireWoods was named as a finalist for AmLaw's Energy Corporate Department list of 2020 and is a leading law firm in the renewable energy industry. We have represented utilities, developers, and independent power producers and projects in over 40 states, totaling over 27 gigawatts of production. In a moment, I will hand things off to Ryan and Durham for their more lengthy introductions, but briefly, I would be remiss in not mentioning that Ryan is in our DC office, and prior to joining McGuireWoods Consulting, he worked for John Hoeven from North Dakota in both the governor's office and the U.S. Senate, where he led his energy policy. He was selected as one of the top lobbyists by the Hill magazine for 2020. Durham is a pioneer and leader in the carbon capture storage 45Q tax credit area, building off his work in the ITC and PTC spaces, among others. At his core, Durham is a renewable energy tax lawyer and co-chair of McGuireWoods Renewable Energy Group. Durham works almost exclusively on renewable transactions and project finance. At this point, I'm going to hand it off to Durham to make a more lengthy intro, and then to Ryan, and we will proceed through the slides. Again, we thank you, and please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A, and we will try to address them as we go through. And if we are unable to address them by the time we end the presentation at 3 Eastern, 2 Central, we will follow up by email with responses. Durham?
Thank you, Doug. And I also want to thank the Renewable Natural Gas Coalition for letting us participate in this webinar regarding 45Q, the carbon capture tax credits, and how this can apply to RNG projects. As Doug mentioned, I'm a tax lawyer in our renewable energy group, and I work almost exclusively helping clients monetize tax credits and in a way that they can use those tax credits in the capital structures for the project finance side of building power plants, building RNG projects, and things of that nature. Ryan, I'll turn it over to you.
Durham, thank you. Doug, appreciate it. And as everybody mentioned, of course, thank you to the Coalition for Renewable Natural Gas. Really appreciate visiting with everybody today. As mentioned, I came over from Senator John Hoeven's office in the U.S. Senate about 3 years ago to McGuireWoods. Prior to that, I actually worked for John Hoeven when he was the governor of North Dakota and handled his energy policy in the state of North Dakota. And since my time there, things have greatly changed in political landscape and frankly in the environmental landscape and energy landscape. When I first started in North Dakota, we didn't have the Bakken development, and a short time later it really blew up, and we understood kind of where that was going to lead, and brought us to putting together some of the first carbon capture programs in the country and the state. And a lot of that policy work followed us out into Washington, D.C., where I had the opportunity to work on basically the enhancement of the 45Q tax credit in 2018. So I've been following these issues very closely and working with clients here in D.C. and across the country on really the intersection of policy and tax and energy, which is, I guess, leading up for today, a very timely discussion on 45Q and the environment and climate change, and how the renewable natural gas and others can play in this policy discussion, and not only today, but moving forward. Climate change, this is an understatement, has really now become a very much leading discussion out here in Washington, D.C. It's really picking up with policymakers, but not only policymakers, but industry and consumers generally. I would say from top to bottom, everybody is talking about climate change and what role can they play in helping reduce the impacts of CO2. This is an urgent debate, but it's a debate that's been around for some time. Like I mentioned, when in 2018 started working and trying to see if there's a way to enhance the 45Q tax credit after being approached by several in industry saying, look, the existing 45Q tax credit was opaque. The incentives were too low. We need to do something about it. And so we started that discussion all the way back in basically 2018. It took until basically recently to have Congress pass the law to enhance the credit, and for IRS to come out and kind of frankly flesh out some of those details about what users can expect when they tap into the 45Q tax credit. So it is a long process, but I think we're here now to an industry and a tax credit that is ripe to be used moving forward to really accomplish the goals that I think all the policymakers and the industry and consumers want to see from such incentives like the 45Q. Well, so talking about climate change and energy, where are we right now? The Energy Information Administration estimates in 2019 that the U.S. still emitted 5.1 billion metric tons of energy-related carbon dioxide. Now that's relative to the world totals of 33.1 billion metric tons. So that puts the United States at about 15%, or a little bit more than 15% of the world's energy-related carbon dioxide emitted. China, for just comparison's sake, is at 28%. So they're significantly higher, obviously very dependent on carbon, but you know, the United States and China are the top two single emitters of carbon in the world. So how are we doing when we look at 2019 then? Okay, we still produce 15% of the world's carbon. Where are we, and where are we going from here? Well, if you look back at basically the benchmark in 1990 set and used by the United Nations framework on the Convention of Climate Change, you could argue we're improving, but are we improving fast enough? Because between 1990 and 2007, basically the energy-related CO2 emissions grew about 1% per year. But this is talked about, but maybe not enough. Since 2007, it peaked and has gone down an average of 1.3% per year. So we are making progress. But I guess the question is, to a lot of people's minds, how are we making that progress? We're still, in 2019, we're still 1.8% greater than we were in 1990. But are we doing enough, and are we doing enough fast enough? That's the debate that's happening right now in Washington, D.C. Well, how do these emissions look over time? We kind of touched on this, but we have a chart here kind of showing the general buildup of CO2 emissions from 1990 to 2007. And you can see now in 2007 basically what happened. Basically two things happened. One, a Of course, we had an economic downturn, which drives a lot of emissions, but we also have basically the unleashing of fracking and natural gas that really changed the whole landscape of CO2 emissions in the country. Natural gas went from around $12 to $15 per million BTU down to roughly a $2 range in a very, very short time. So you can really see the drop there in 2007, 2008, corresponding to both the economics and to the natural gas prices and fracking, really making a difference. And that's tailed off and kind of slowly declined since 2007, 2008. Of course, everybody knows 2020. We're using 2019 numbers, kind of last official numbers by the EIA, but it looks like 2020 will be very much below previous year's CO2, with approximately 10 to 11% reduction of CO2 in 2020 versus 2019. Obviously, that's the lockdown, and nobody's using that as a long-term indicator of where we are, but we have made some progress in this area. And where have we made that progress? Well, let's look at the emissions by fuel type. And this is really a breakdown of probably where the U.S. is going to have to do some work and where things have actually changed. You can see the petroleum has stayed fairly level as far as emissions by fuel type. Natural gas, as we talked, has stayed fairly level but started to increase overall. And then the industry, no secret to anybody, I'm sure, on this webinar, that's taken the biggest beating and downturn from industry use is coal. They had the biggest drop by far since 2006 to 7. They've really started decreasing to now they produce less CO2 because there's less production from coal than of natural gas. So really, what does that mean by emission by sector? The end use. This is where a lot of the policymakers kind of look to see where we need to either provide some incentives or provide some shifting of policy. And you can see the transportation sector over the years has generally been pretty level and even, all the way back from the 90s, kind of topping a little bit in 06, but dipping down slightly and increasing towards now 2020. So the transportation sector has been pretty steady. Industries, the other side, has been fairly steady. It dropped a little bit, but between transportation and industry, that's your two main drivers of end-use CO2. Residential and commercial, it's there, dropped a little bit, but there's some talk in DC about what can we do for energy efficiency, retrofitting of residents and commercial use. It's really not there. It's really on the transportation and industry sectors where I think the policymakers are going to look, largely because they've been pretty static and pretty tough to budge down. So, I think as you can see translating, and we'll talk about it later in the Biden plan, transportation and industry are the main focuses moving forward. In the next slide, we just really try to point out here, look at natural gas, how it's taken off as an industry fuel CO2. It's kind of natural gas has not gotten, I think, the recognition that it deserves to help reduce overall CO2 emissions. But now, in 2020, natural gas has the highest CO2 emission from industrial fuels, because it's being used a lot. There's a great benefit to natural gas, but now it's starting to be the industrial fuel that's sticking up, if you will, to policymakers to look at what can we do to help now address natural gas as it relates to CO2 emissions. Industrial CO2 basically going down a little bit, and petroleum's holding steady. So again, two areas that are holding steady are going up, natural gas and petroleum. Policymakers are going to look at that. So where are we now policy-wise? Overall, I think everybody recognizes we need to do more, especially in reducing CO2 as it relates to reduction as we depend on natural gas and CO2 and petroleum and other transportation sectors. So where are we moving forward? Well, the big policy discussions that have happened in the last few years have basically been the Paris Agreement. In 2016, this was crafted during the Obama administration, U.S. pledged to cut greenhouse gas emissions to 25% below the 2005 levels as the benchmark year by 2025. We will say that we are not on track to meet that goal, although we'll probably meet it in 2020 because we'll be very close to about the 20% reduction that we are looking for under the Paris Agreements. But in all likelihood, we won't make it to the 25% below by 2025 as our economy continues to rebound. So what do we do now? With the new administration, what is their focus? Well, they're going beyond, much beyond the Paris Agreement. You've all probably heard President Biden announced recently we're going to aggressively reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So much so that he's hoping to have a 50% reduction from that 2025 levels by 2030 and create a carbon pollution-free power sector by 2035 and create a net zero emission economy by no later than 2050. That's obviously very significant, very significant. So how do we get to 100% carbon pollution-free electricity by 2035? Well, the administration is going to put a lot of money and time and effort behind deploying carbon pollution-free electricity generation sources, transmission, and energy storage. They're going to put a lot of money behind electric vehicles for the transportation sector, kind of the two big sectors that haven't budged in the past. And they're also going to look at how do we address it by industrial producers. Well, we think here is obviously a big place to play with renewable energy, nuclear energy, and waste to power. We still have a lot to go, but this is where the administration's trying to focus. So how do we get there? And is carbon-free generation really the only way to achieve carbon pollution-free power by 2035? I would say no, it's not possible. But you look at what the Biden administration has put forward, roughly a $2 trillion infrastructure package basically designed to go to energy development and energy usage. A lot of that money is going to go to wind and solar. They're also looking to invest in research for the energy grid and battery storage. And on that transportation sector side, they want to go to electric vehicles. But they understand and they know that they can't get to a full generation by just wind and solar without any fossil fuel or carbon or renewable natural gas. So that's, I think, where the Biden administration recognizes the need for 45Q. 45Q is in Biden's infrastructure energy plan. They do want to expand and reform it. It's a little unclear at this point how far they'll go with that. I think in the next 45 days, we'll start seeing some legislation put down on paper about what that looks like. I think the House wants to pass something by around July 4th, and maybe we see something by probably September or so, how that's moving through both the House and the Senate. Now, that's where they want to start, but Secretary Granholm has said, the Secretary of Energy, we want to use carrots at this point to get industry to move. We absolutely are going to put money behind this. We're going to put incentives behind it, but we're not opposed to eventually using the stick through the EPA or even DOE on some of these areas. But right now, they're going to put a ton of money behind expanding 45Q, wind and solar, and other things. What they will likely do on 45Q in the Biden administration plan is pull off the shelf of what's going through Congress now on the carbon capture, utilization, and storage tax credit bill introduced by 17 senators, both Republicans and Democrats, that looks to extend the commencement period for construction, allows direct payments for carbon capture, and is looking to increase the 45Q tax credit for projects from about $50, what it is now, to $120 for sequestration, and $35 to $75 for oil and gas field use, EOR basically. So they're looking at maybe trying to expand it, even put more money behind 45Q. And we're feeling like that is a real likelihood here during the energy debate over the next 45 days or so. The other thing to look forward to here in this sector is the role that agriculture will play in climate change discussions. Agriculture has really picked up as far as a needed sector to address climate change. Last couple of years, we've probably seen that really explode out here in Washington, D.C., to the point where I think agriculture really can help lead on this discussion, and especially when you get the intersection between agriculture and energy. That's where a lot of the policymakers are going to be looking at. What can they do to incentivize both agriculture and energy? Agriculture may actually be the first place that has a carbon bank that comes to fruition, and they're going to combine that with sequestration, and I think we'll see some money put behind that pretty soon. We got a bill that's been introduced by a good bipartisan group that includes Mike Braun, Debbie Stabenow in the Senate, that is really putting some effort behind this agriculture area in carbon markets and sequestration. So this is all kind of tying together with 45Q, and we're very excited about the possibility of what 45Q may hold in the future. So with that, I will turn it over to the crew here to talk more about 45Q and what it actually means on a day-to-day basis.
So I want to talk a little bit about, what is 45Q, and before I do that, I want to, just kind of talk more generally, because we've just focused on, the Biden administration and, the plans for reducing, carbon emission in the United States as a whole. And, when an administration makes lofty goals like that, it really has three avenues to modify the United States economy, and one of which is to spend. The second is regulation, and the third, and often most frequent used, is tax policy. And that's exactly what 45Q is. It's tax policy to incentivize business to kind of change the way it's operating. And so 45Q at its heart is a tax credit for the capture of carbon from industry, and then using that same carbon in a different commercial purpose or stored geologically. It was enacted, to incentivize private industry to modify, the way it's been emitting carbon, and in turn capture and sequester it or utilize it. The 45Q incentives really are akin to what the production tax credit and investment tax credit are for the renewable energy industry. 45Q is about the capture of carbon, where the PTC and the ITC are all about the production or the construction of a renewable energy project that was a listed type of technology that would typically not emit any sort of carbon emissions, or were kind of a select technology that had lower carbon emissions. The one interesting thing about 45Q as opposed to the PTC and ITC is 45Q is really industry agnostic. If there's an industry or an industrial facility that's emitting carbon, it can qualify for 45Q so long as it meets certain capture thresholds, which we'll get into in a little bit more detail later on. Whereas the PTC and ITC are legislatively geared towards specific technologies like wind or solar or geothermal or biomass. And so in this instance, you don't have to fit into a certain industry or technology specific facility, but in turn, it's all about the capture of carbon that's already being emitted. And so what it requires is to build a new capture facility. And therefore, you're reducing the amount of carbon that otherwise would have gone into the atmosphere. There's also another very interesting aspect of 45Q, which doesn't necessarily apply to RNG, but I think is interesting to note is that direct air capture of carbon is something that's contemplated by 45Q as well. And once again, these tax credits are intended to drive industry to think of new ways of operating, ways that typically aren't economical to begin with, but through government policy, they're trying to drive that change. So the other interesting aspect of 45Q is that you then have to utilize this captured carbon in a different form. So it's a two-step, as this table describes what a 45Q project is. It's a two-step process. You got to capture the carbon from the facility, and then secondly, utilize it or in an industrial use or other commercial use. One of the most frequent is enhanced oil recovery, because that's an existing industry that is using the CO2 to extract more oil from fields that are maybe depleted or just want to be more productive. But there's also just the outright sequestration of it, typically in a salt cavern or other geological storage areas, and then finally just in a different kind of commercial use that many of which you might not even be contemplated right now. The other thing to keep in mind about 45Q is it's a 12-year tax credit. So you get a tax credit for the capture of each metric ton of carbon from that facility for 12 years after it goes operational. So it is a long-lived tax credit. So, how did we get here? Originally, 45Q was enacted in 2008. And then amended shortly thereafter. We characterize this typically as the old 45Q. It was used by industry, particularly the power sector. There's a few projects out there that qualified for the old 45Q tax credits. And what happened in 2018 was that Congress looked at 45Q and wanted to make it more utilized. And so they revamped it in a meaningful way, and this is why we're talking about it today, because part of that revamping process in 2018 really didn't get finalized until earlier this year in 2021, and that's because even after the Congress revised 48Q, they gave a lot of discretion to the IRS to come out with guidance as to how this was all going to work, and the whole idea was to make 45Q a financeable tax credit, much like it is in the wind and solar industry. Because before the 45Q was revamped, most projects were balance sheet financed by the owners of those facilities, and third-party financing was a little bit difficult to get because of some uncertainties surrounding the credit, particularly one that required it to expire once the industry as a whole, had met a cap on capture itself. So there was this cliff effect where, unbeknownst to anyone, that credit would just fall away. Well, that's something that was done with when 45Q was revamped. And so what we're likely to be seeing in the future moving forward is 45Q projects being financed with tax equity investment, third-party lenders, in some ways similar to what we're seeing with wind for the PTC and solar with the ITC.
So regarding renewable natural gas and carbon capture, generally there are four main categories of sources: landfills, anaerobic digestion at wastewater treatment facilities, then anaerobic digestion in the livestock arena, whether it's poultry or swine or dairy, and then you have also standalone organic systems as well. What is RNG generally? It's biogas. That's been upgraded to be used in place of fossil fuel geologic gas. It typically has a CH4 content between 45 and 65%, depending on the source. And to convert it, it has to go through a number of steps, and we'll talk about some of these projects and explain how that works in some of the succeeding slides. You have to remove the carbon dioxide, the moisture, and all the contaminants, and you'll often hear the term siloxanes, volatile organic compounds, hydrogen sulfide, and then you also have to reduce other elements in the stream, including nitrogen and oxygen. And generally, once you get to a higher level of CH4 content, which is roughly 90% or greater, then if you increase it even more, you'll get to injectable gas. That obviously has to meet pipeline specs in order to do that. But there are lots of different ways to harness the gas and transport it rather than just inject it in a pipeline. Interestingly, the IRS, through its regulations, have stated that the separation of carbon oxide from the other commercially viable gases is a manufacturing process, and the captured carbon oxide would qualify for the 45Q tax credit. In terms of actual projects, we've got a couple slides here just to generically walk through that actual process. This first is really dealing with the landfill gas system, where you would harness the gas from the actual landfill itself with wells, and there are wells and gathering systems placed in the landfill to pull out the gas. Then it is actually treated through the processes we just described to remove the contaminants, and then you would clean and compress it. That, depending on the level of compression and the other cleaning we just described, you could have gas created at different points in that process, and that is what is described here. Importantly, when you, as discussed in this slide, you do have a step where there is removal of the CO2 and other elements that we just mentioned before in order to make it injectable or useful for certain purposes. And later we will talk about specifically on the CO2 side what the uses are for it. But that's a landfill treatment, landfill gas treatment system description there. And then on, as we mentioned, the anaerobic digestion side, which oftentimes you hear in concert with wastewater treatment systems, food, fat, oil, and grease, food systems that are being treated, as well as all the agricultural uses, whether it's dairy or swine or poultry. All of those types of systems will find their way into an anaerobic digestion scenario, and in that case, you oftentimes will have different products created, not just the gas, but also fertilizers, other types of soil amendments, and perhaps other uses that may result. And it sometimes depends on the type of feedstock that is used, and then additionally what other treatments are used for that digested material. But here you see a description of sort of those two streams, if you will, of gas production and digested material, going through on the gas side, the moisture removal, and then also the cleaning of the siloxanes and the H2S and other types of, or sulfur and other types of elements, and ultimately to the CO2 removal, which is a step in there. And again, that's the system that you would be focused on for the 45Q. Importantly, and Durham will address some of this, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, that some of these existing operations, you'll be able to overlay, if you will, the credit into that situation when you bring in the qualifying facilities. And that will obviously, from a credit perspective, make it a much more palatable situation.
Yeah, and Doug, I want to go back to the last slide. It's similar to the first slide with the landfill gas, but as you were alluding to on the CO2 removal process, the RNG plant, really, that's what it is. It's circled here on this diagram because that's the 42 or the 45Q facility we're thinking about, and it's not the whole RNG process. It's just that equipment to capture that CO2 that was already going to be flared or emitted into the atmosphere anyways. And so this credit isn't intended to require industry to go out and build a whole new RNG cleaning plant. And what it's intended to do is to add the types of equipment that's put onto that plant kind of as a separate transaction, where that CO2 is put into a pipeline or put onto trucks instead of into the atmosphere, and then used in a commercial purpose or sequestered into the ground in one shape or form. And I think that's a key takeaway, in that we're not talking about building an entirely new plant. We're just trying to figure out a better way to capture that CO2 rather than emit it.
And Durham, if you don't mind, there are a couple of related questions that have come in on that point, just in terms of structuring and the overlay. Can you walk through generally how these credits, as you work through the next slides, how these credits are actually monetized and sold, and the concepts of entities that may not have tax appetite versus entities that do? That would be great.
Yes, definitely. And that's a great transition into the next slide. So for the next couple of slides, I want to just kind of dive in more detail for 45Q, and so people can understand, the economics behind it. And really what I'm doing here is we're comparing, what this old 45Q was, prior to 2018 to what it is now. Because once again, the whole intent of the changes in 2018 were to make this more economical, more utilized in all of industry, and potentially financeable. And so what we're seeing is, there's really three ways to use the credits, or three ways you get the credits. Remember, keep in mind, you got to capture it, and then it's got to be used. It's a two-step process. And so if you use it in EOR, enhanced oil recovery, it's really a lower credit. There's a ramp up in it. So it starts at $12.83 per metric ton that's captured each year. And once again, this is for 12 years. So the dollars can be significant. And then it will cap out at $35. I don't have the schedule in front of me, but I think in about 3 or 4 years, we'll be at that $35 cap. And then if it's pumped into the ground, it's not used in a commercial purpose, but it's secured and stored geologically, the credit's higher. It starts at $22 and change, and then ramps up to $50. And the reason for that is Congress recognized that there's not a market for the CO2, and so the federal coffers are subsidizing the entirety of the capture, where in EOR there's existing commercial markets for selling and buying this CO2 byproduct. And then finally, the utilization concept. This was added, and what it's doing, it's pretty agnostic. It's saying, hey, you don't have to use the CO2 just in enhanced oil recovery. If there's another commercial purpose for it, even commercial purposes that we don't even recognize yet or understand yet, that you'd still get that same dollar amount. It's the lower $12 and change, ramping up to $35. But the idea there is that there's another revenue stream from the industry, the facility that was capturing that CO2, because they would be selling it for a commercial use. And we will talk a little bit more about what are these commercial uses, because I think that's a natural question. It's like, hey, we don't have our ag facility next door to or near an oil field, so enhanced oil recovery might not make sense commercially, because the transportation cost just would make it not economical. And so thinking about other uses kind of opens the door for 45Q, particularly if Biden's policies, this current administration's policies, the long-term policies are going to be met. All industries are going to have to find ways to capture carbon and to be zero emitters. The other thing that was removed from the old to the new 45Q was this 25 million metric ton cap. Now it's just a flat-out 12-year credit. So if a project has begun construction by we'll talk about it in a minute on the next slide, be at the begin construction by the end of 2025, and at that point the project's, kind of, for lack of a better term, say it's safe harbored, it's qualified for the 45Q. Now there's a lot of other kind of T's to cross and I's to dot, but that's the kind of basic threshold. At that point, the project, once it's completed and operational, it will qualify for these tax credits for the remaining 12 years of its life, based on the amount of carbon it's capturing each year. It was expanded to include all amounts of all types of carbon oxide, not just CO2. It was originally just carbon dioxide. Now it's all types of carbon. So it opens up the industry, particularly like for the credit for like steel industry, things of that nature. One of the more interesting aspects from my perspective as a tax lawyer is it changed the ability, like who can claim the tax credit. Before it had to be the facility itself. You had to own the industrial facility. So in our case, it would be that RNG processing plant. Well, now it's just the equipment that captures the carbon, and that's something that we alluded to in the last slide. Is that the credit now is not requiring someone to bring an investor into the ownership chain of the RNG facility, but instead they would just be brought in on the financing side as an owner in the capture side. And I'm not an engineer, so I don't know exactly what those will look like, but it's by intuitively and common sense, the capital cost for that should be significantly different, much lower. The other interesting aspect of 45Q as it was revised is the credit can be transferred. It's one of the few credits, tax credits out there that can actually be transferred. Keep in mind that the PTC and the ITC, which 45Q is kind of building on, those can't be transferred. Those are only given, or they're allocated to owners in those projects. So when we talk about tax equity, financings and things like that, those are partnerships. And so those types of financings are structured in a way that a financial institution that has a large tax appetite over a long period of time will come in and pay upfront pursuant to a fairly complicated financial model, a kind of a fixed price to become an owner in that facility, and it's typically in a flip structure, at least for wind. And the ITC has other structures, although the flip structure is used commonly there too. For 45Q, the IRS issued a notice last year as a safe harbor, which mimicked the wind safe harbor, which allows for tax equity investors to participate in 45Q projects as an owner in a partnership in a tax equity flip model. And the basics of that is tax equity would be allocated no more than 99% of all the tax kind of goodies, which are the depreciation and the credits, which are these 45Q tax credits. And then 1% of those tax goodies gets allocated to the sponsor, which is the other owner of the project. And then once certain economic thresholds are met, usually it's an after-tax IRR, which makes these investments act a lot like a loan. That's why they're called a financing, even though for tax purposes it is an equity ownership interest. They would flip down to, which can't be anything less than a 5% ownership interest. So they go from 99 to 5, and they can go anywhere in between. So sometimes you know tax equity might only want 75% of the tax credits, just because that's the way the financial model works. And so there's flexibility to do different amounts, but it is typically a 99-1 flip, or sorry, 99-5 flip. So they flip down to 5%. The other key aspects of a flip structure is after tax equity flips, typically the sponsor would have the right to buy them out, and so they could be bought out, for then fair market value of that 5%. So it's kind of like at that point, once you've monetized all the tax credits with the tax equity investor, the sponsor / owner of the project makes one final last payment and then becomes the 100% owner outright, and it's kind of business as usual with a single owner. There's lots of T's to cross and I's to dot, and how to structure that flip to satisfy the IRS safe harbor, but it's done all the time in wind and solar deals, and so it's an industry that is ripe to be applied into 45Q. What we're dealing with right now is we've gotten all these safe harbor notices, but we're trying to figure out, or I think tax equity is trying to figure out, one, the technologies, understand the risks surrounding them, and then also the utilization and capture aspect of it. And so with all that being said, there's still some wood to chop here, but it's very promising. We talked about the begin construction requirement already, and then the direct air capture we've talked about. One of the final and more important aspects is, in order to qualify, you have to be one of these industry facilities that emits at least a certain amount of metric tons annually. And so for anything that was emitting less than 500 metric tons of carbon dioxide annually, you have to capture at least 25,000 a year. So that's a threshold, and if you don't meet that, you fall out of 45Q. So anytime you get a tax equity investor, they're going to want to make sure that there's enough cushion there to make sure that you're always capturing enough. Because if you capture, 24,000, you're just not going to get credits that year. And from electrical facilities, they have to capture at least 500,000 metric tons. And then finally, for all other facilities that don't fall into other categories, you have to capture at least 100,000 metric tons of carbon a year to qualify for 45Q.
And Durham, can you talk, when you say facilities, plural, will you just elaborate on what the relevance of that is in the credit scheme, and how you could aggregate? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so facilities we'll talk about. So I apologize for the nomenclature, because facilities in this context is the industrial facility that's really the emitter. So the CO2 emitter is the facility. So that's the threshold test. You have to identify that. But then for the 45Q ownership and the capture element, that's the equipment. So that's like the qualifying equipment. We would normally call that the facility, like in the wind and the solar context, but here there's a little bit of separation. And so you have tax equity and the sponsor, the originator of the 45 credits, the equipment that's on, quote, the facility. So here it's the equipment. And then you can aggregate it. So if there are, there's an aggregation concept in the wind industry, because each wind turbine is treated as a separate, quote, like facility, and you can aggregate those into a single project. So there's a similar concept here, where in order to meet these minimum capture thresholds, you might not have one one facility that's emitting this much, but when you look at all the different wellheads either at a landfill gas site, or even somewhat centrally located anaerobic digesters, you can aggregate those, but there's certain thresholds to meet. You have to be financed together. They have to be kind of described as a single project. So there are ways to aggregate, but you would want to look at it very closely, and there's a lot of I think opportunity there for aggregation, but so I guess and I think what Doug was meaning is just because you don't think you meet these minimum thresholds on day one, there is an aggregation rule that you should at least look into to see if you can make it work. And that brings us to how do you use this? If you're not going to go into EOR, and Doug, I'll let you jump in here.
Oh no, that's great. Anybody, Ryan, Durham. One of the questions we're fielding a lot is what are the uses, and for industrials particularly, there are a number. I think what we're trying to illustrate here with this this slide is the fact that there are a lot of potential uses of the CO2. Obviously, there is, on the one hand, the technology issues that Durham already discussed, and then the other here is just a functional relationship of the capturing and the use and the feasibility of all that. And obviously, much like Durham's engineering comment, we're not here to suggest that any of this is all financially feasible, but to illustrate the fact that there are a lot of potential uses, and depending on the business model and other factors, the ultimate use might be dependent upon some of those criteria. But as you look through it, it runs the full gamut of consumer products and food and industrial uses and other actual types of renewable energy production, maybe even algae, green or carbon capture or other greenhouse gas reduction techniques. Obviously dry ice has been a popular topic the last year. Any specific comments here? I want to be mindful of time, Durham and Ryan, and perhaps we'll move on, and if we have more time, we can come back to the uses, but why don't we move ahead to the remaining few slides?
Yeah, and I can go through these rather quickly because we've covered most of this already in kind of the lead up, and we'll be sending around these slides so people have them after today's webinar. But we've talked about the carbon capture equipment. Once again, it's not the industrial facility. You don't have to bring tax equity, or the credit arises from the owner of the new capture equipment, which could be very minimal, or in some instances very expensive if you're thinking about a coal-fired power plant. Adding carbon capture equipment to that is very costly. But in the RNG space, since the CO2 is already being separated, the capital expenditure could realistically be much less. We talked about the aggregation principle. Here they're looking at common ownership, same physical location under a single plan, to construct and finance and permit. So it won't apply to all fact patterns, but it might for many. The other thing to think of, in the anaerobic digester context, sometimes you might have dairy farms that are relatively close proximity, but they're not contiguous, and so you could have just the biogas supply lines go into a single RNG facility, and then you're capturing 5 or 6 dairy farm ADs processors in one RNG facility, and then you only add the carbon capture equipment to one RNG facility rather than in 5 separate ones. And the other thing with the use or storage, this is really from the financing perspective where it's going to get a little sticky, is because you have to have a binding written contract with a third party, or I guess you could do it yourself, and you wouldn't have to have that binding written contract. But most of you, in the RNG industry, you're not in the business of utilizing CO2, nor in enhanced oil recovery. So you have to contract with a third party for that commercial use or for that secure geological storage. And there's certain T's to cross and I's to dot in that binding written contract as well. You're going to want commercial parties, a commercially viable party on the other side as well. So if there's recourse, because if the CO2 is later emitted because you're putting it into a salt cavern and it was emitted, or in the enhanced oil recovery industry, if later on it comes out the other end, in an amount greater than was originally anticipated, there's a recapture of the credit, and that's a 3-year recapture period. So there's kind of this rolling 3-year clock where the IRS looks at, was this really stored geologically, and the IRS just came out with some regulations just a few months ago that recapture period was 3 years. So, and then the other thing with claiming the credits, you can pass it on to the party that's utilizing or storing it. So it doesn't have to all be monetized with tax equity. It can be monetized by the oil and gas company. It can be monetized by the other company that has a commercial use for it. So it might all just depend on that business's tax appetite as well. But there's a more readily available market for that as well. And then we have talked about the tax equity structures, and in the flip structure that the IRS has issued its notice for. With that, Doug, I'll pass it off to you to talk about some of these bottlenecks.
Yeah, and thank you, Durham, and Durham and Ryan. As we wrap this up, I will say to the group, we've tried to address a lot of the questions that have come in. We appreciate those questions. If we have not, we're hopeful that we can we'll have your email and contact information to respond after the call when we stop in a few minutes. And in that vein, we just again thank the RNG Coalition for this opportunity to address this important issue and this new development in the carbon capture arena that we think could benefit not only society as a whole, I guess, but also the businesses that are in this arena. Some of the bottlenecks in that regard, and we've tried to touch on a few of these as we've gone through it, from the commercial viability and financial feasibility angles. You putting these projects together you require numerous parties. Obviously, that's a lot of time, coordination. That's after the technology issues and likely financial feasibility issues will already have been addressed. But in that vein, some of the things that have to be dealt with in any transaction are the opportunity and related costs that arise from investing that time and effort into doing the transaction, and then addressing the compliance issues that arise afterwards, particularly when different entities are created and partnerships, and not only just maintaining the business, but also the new equipment, and plus the whole IRS regulatory regime. We talked about the aggregation. We think that's a key. That, along with the transfer, are key helpful ingredients to this new credit. Is the proximity of the use and the capture make the project, make the business venture feasible? Identifying cost-competitive equipment, as we talked about, and then, of course, education and establishing market information about these uses and tech requirements. We've seen that over the last 15, 20 years with other areas of renewable energy, and certainly wouldn't expect this to be any different. And with that, I just will reiterate our great thanks to your time and attention today to listen to us, and you should feel free to reach out to anyone here or the RNG Coalition itself. And on behalf of my colleagues Ryan Bernstein and Durham McCormick, I thank you very much, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.